Hi, and welcome to part 2 of my tutorial on how to make a guitar at home from scratch with the bare minimum tools, entirely by hand and with little to no experience with woodworking. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a first part to this tutorial where I go through all the stuff that you need to know before attempting to build your first guitar. And there's also a more cinematic video where I show you the entire build without saying a word. I know I said that this would be a two-part series, but the instructional video will be way longer than I expected, so I have to split it in two. Now enough talking, here comes the first part of the step-by-step guide. Et pour ceux qui auraient du mal à suivre en anglais, j'ai mis des sous-titres en belge. I typically begin by deciding what the top is going to look like. For this guitar, I went for a very classical look, with those flames sitting in the middle and pointing towards the headstock. I also have to make sure that the nuts and cracks won't interfere with the construction. Talking about the construction, notice the grain orientation on those boards. There are two schools of thoughts here, but in the end, I don't think it matters much. Just pick the option that looks the best to you. I chose option B because I learned furniture making before guitar making, so it sort of became a habit to glue my panels that way. Once you're happy with the composition, you can mark it with a triangle, so it doesn't get mixed up later on. Before cutting or gluing anything, make sure that the milling process got rid of any warp in your boards. If it's not the case, then go back to the jointer planer or at the wood store if that's where you got it milled. The last step before committing to glue the body blank is to make sure that the glued surfaces will mate perfectly. I usually take care of that with a hand plane, but it can also be done with a machine called a jointer. In this first example, the edges haven't been jointed, and when I put the seam against a light source, you can noticeably see the light coming through. And that's a very bad thing, because there's no way this can be glued. Here, the edges have been jointed, and you cannot see the light coming through anymore. So now we're good to go. Before a glue up, I always like to make a dry fit with my clamps, just to make sure that I have enough of them for a given job. In this case, you can probably get away with 3 long clamps and 2 regular clamps. The glue up in itself is very straightforward. Just put glue on the 2 surfaces and spread it evenly. Then clamp both ends of the glue joint with regular clamps for a perfect alignment. And then finally tighten the long clamps. A few things are worth mentioning for this part. First, I know I use too much glue. I just can't help it. Second, you might be tempted to use biscuits or dominoes, but the glue is plenty strong on its own. And lastly, you can sprinkle a few grains of salt on the glue joint to prevent slipping, but I never had to do that for a guitar. Once everything is in place, you can let the glue cure overnight. Here I'm just checking for flatness across the 2 boards. I've never had an issue before, but you never know. You can now remove the dried excess glue. I used a chisel, but you can do it with a card scraper or a hand plane. Now we can glue the paper template to the body blank. I use spray glue, but you can use a glue stick. Pay attention to the center line of the template. It has to be perfectly in line with the glue joint, which is now our natural center line for the rest of the project. Here, I'm using 2 clamps to firmly attach the body blank to the workbench, but leaving quite a bit of overhang to have a good clearance when using the handsaw. The process of cutting the body contour is very straightforward, but it can be time-consuming when you do it only by hand. So if you have a bandsaw or a simple jigsaw, then don't try to be a hero and just use them. The general principle is very easy. All you need to do is to cut successive straight lines to remove big chunks of wood, and the pattern is really up to you. The offcuts are going to get smaller and smaller, and in the end you'll have something that already looks like a guitar, despite having cut only straight lines. For the 2 tight curves, using a coping saw on a 45mm board can be challenging, if not impossible for some cheap models. So instead, just drill a couple of holes that match the radii of the curves. My only advice is to stay away from the final line. Even more so if you're a beginner. If you're not sure that your cuts are perfectly square, keep a safe distance from the paper template. I'd say 3 to 5mm is a good starting point. Just for good measure, make a few practice cuts very far away from the final line, and see how much the blade is drifting. Remember, you can always remove wood, but you can never put it back. I can't believe I just said that. Now I'm rasping away any excess material, using a Shinto rasp. That tool is awesome and it's also very cheap. You can use the aggressive side to get very close to the line, but always check for squareness as you go. I got very close to the line on the top side of the edge first. That's where the template is sitting. And then I went on and corrected any undercut on the bottom side. After that, I use a variety of tools to flatten the high spots. Here you can see me using a chisel, but off camera I'll also use the card scraper and a simple piece of sandpaper wrapped around a piece of PVC tubing. Well, this was very satisfying and everything, but we're gonna leave the body there for now and start shaping the neck. The neck blank is 85mm wide, but we're gonna mark the center line at 38mm from one of the edges. That's because the tally headstock is not symmetrical. I used the marking gauge, but you can have the same result with a simple ruler or a marking knife with a pencil. The center line is very precious, so always keep track of it. If it fades out during the build, just draw it back and don't forget to mark the end grain too. There's a file called Telecaster Nut Width. You'll have to print it out and cut the contours, and then transfer the shape of the neck onto the neck blank with a pencil. As you can see in the clip, I'm using an MDF template that I kept from my first build, but I didn't use a router this time, so a simple paper template would have been more than enough. Now we're gonna mark the position of the truss rod channel. You cannot do this step without having the actual truss rod in your possession. Also, my truss rod is going to be adjusted on the heel side of the neck, between the fretboard and the neck pickup. You could do it the other way around with the truss rod axis on the headstock side, but I won't be able to show you how. My truss rod is 6mm wide, which is also conveniently the same width as my smallest chisel. So here I'm drawing two lines, 3mm away from the center line. The space in between those lines is the width of the channel. I'm also marking the position of the end of the truss rod. Here I'm clamping my ruler on one of the lines that I just drew. It's going to act like a fence for the chisel, and you'll automatically get a nice straight line no matter how clumsy you are. The first step is very easy and straightforward. For the sake of explanation, I took a piece of ash just to show you exactly what's going on inside the channel. All you have to do is hold the chisel vertically and strike it down a few times with the back of the chisel facing you. As you can see, the first strokes don't do much, but then at some point you can start to lever away the wood debris, thus creating the channel. Also notice how the chisel tends to go towards you. Don't worry, it's designed to do that, and later on I'll make a last video explaining how to use the basic tools. Now that the bulk of the material is out of the way, you can see that the bottom of the channel is completely irregular, and we want a consistent depth, which in my case would be 8mm. To do that, you can start by using your chisel again, with the bevel facing down, just to remove the most obvious high spots. To make the bottom completely flat, you will need to use a hand router or a specialty plane called a plow plane. But I have neither, so I gently stole this idea from Paul Sellers. I will leave a link in the description. This is called a poor man's hand router, and it's very simple to do. It consists of a simple block of wood with a hole drilled at a 45-degree angle. Then all you have to do is insert the chisel in the hole with the bevel facing down, and boom, you've got yourself a hand router. Just a quick note though. This tool is best used when chiseling across the grain, and we're gonna use it with the grain. So depending on how friendly your wood is, this step might be very frustrating. Here's my final result. The bottom is completely flat with a few dents here and there, but other than that, it's perfectly functional. For this specific type of truss rod, the end with the adjustment nut is ever so slightly wider. So to make it fit, you'll have to do a bit of chiseling or rasping at that end of the channel. Now that the truss rod channel is ready, we can start cutting out the neck and headstock contours. This step is also very easy. Just use the coping saw for the curves, and the Japanese saw to make quick work of the sides and the straight part of the headstock. And as always, try to stay at a healthy distance from the final line. To get very close to the final line, I used a hand plane, a rasp, and sandpaper. Those three tools will get the job done without too much trouble. You'll have to be mindful of the grain direction at all times. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, I'll explain it to you in the next episode. And as with the body, always check for squareness as you go. Now that the neck is roughly shaped, we can go on and make the fretboard. First, glue the fretboard template to the blank. As I told you in the first video, there's no PDF file with just the fretboard on. So just print out the neck template the second time and cut out the fretboard from that. You'll see that after the nut, there's no line indicating where the fretboard actually ends. I was distracted and cut my fretboard template a little too short, so I struggled a bit when making the fretboard to headstock transition. I advise you to draw a line at 10 mm from the nut and cut the template there. My fretboard blank was already tapered when I bought it. That's why I'm doing this step now, which is simply removing the excess wood on the sides. This actually makes things more complicated for the miter box, so if the fretboard blank is a rectangle, skip this part and do it when the fret slots are cut. Here I'm simply gluing my tapered fretboard to some kind of rectangle raft, so I can have a reference for the miter box. Again, this is not needed if your blank is already a rectangle. You can cut the fret slots entirely freehand, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. You'll be much more precise and consistent if you use a miter box, and in the end your guitar will have a better intonation. The depth of the slot should be between 1.5 and 2 mm. For the nut slot, use the saw to cut the outer lines, and then use a small chisel to remove the little strip of wood left between them. I forgot to film that part, so you'll have to use your imagination here. If your fretboard is still a rectangle at this stage, now is the time to make the taper. Just use a plane or a rasp to do so. And this time get to the final line. You'll have to be very precise because this is going to influence the rest of the build, as the fretboard width will determine the neck width, but also the neck pocket's shape and dimensions. Here comes what is probably the worst part of this project, making the fretboard radius. There's nothing much to say about it. All you have to do is stick a piece of sandpaper under the radius sanding block and go to work. I usually start with an aggressive grit like 60 or 80 and end up with 120 or 240 when I'm close to the end. It's easier to glue the fretboard in place with CA glue or double-sided tape. That way you won't have the clamps getting in your way. Everyone has a tendency to lean over one side or the other. So I made myself a little jig that keeps the radius block in the middle. It's the first time that I tried that technique and it helped me a lot since I only used one hand. I start by marking the entire surface with the pencil. That way I can check my progress as I go. The center line shouldn't be affected by the radiusing. When it starts to fade, that means that you're done. Also, try to flip the piece from time to time, sanding from the first fret to the last and then from the last to the first, just to average out any tendency to sand one side over the other. You can check your progress by using a radius gauge. A paper template glued to a piece of cardboard works just as well. I'll leave a link in the description. I always keep the sawdust from my projects. It might come handy sometime, you never know. The fretboard is now basically done. All that's left to do is rounding the corners at the heel end. To do that, I just use a chisel, and then fine-tune it with a file. But you can do that with any tool you want. You can choose to put the frets in place now, or you can do it later when the fretboard is gonna be glued to the neck. Since I don't have a fret press, I used the radius sanding block and the large clamp, and surprisingly, that worked just fine. I'm still gonna buy a fret press though. For this job, you can also use a simple hammer. That's what I've been doing for 7 builds. Just hammer the sides first, and then the middle portion of the wire, to keep the ends from springing up as you hit the middle. When you're done, use a fret cutter to cut the wire flush with the fretboard. Here I'm using a simple jig to file off any metal part that's protruding from the fretboard. If you have a table saw, this jig is very easy to make. But if you don't, I don't think it's worth buying the jig for a first guitar. You can simply do it by hand with a metal file, 1 fret at a time, and about 44 times. Now I'm simply using the other side of the jig to put a 30 to 45 degree angle on the fret ends. You can also do it by hand, just make sure that you don't damage the fretboard edge. Let's get back to the neck. Now we're gonna create this profile here. If you have a router or a bandsaw, just remove the excess wood. And that's 15 mm from the backside of the headstock. You can also rip cut it with a Japanese saw, but I wanted to play safe. You'll see in a second. Here I'm scribing a line at 15 mm away from the back of the headstock. Don't forget to leave enough width to make the headstock to fretboard transition. You'll see what I mean with the next few clips. To remove the excess material, I simply use the saw and make a series of parallel cuts on the whole area. Then I use a small chisel to carefully cut out every strip of wood, one by one. This technique is usually used to cut half-lap joints by hand. Just make sure that you don't go all the way through the headstock with the chisel. Instead, take care of one side and then the other to avoid tear outs. When you're done with the roughing out part, you can use a hand plane or a rasp to get to the final depth. We're now gonna tackle what is perhaps the most intimidating but also the most rewarding part of making a guitar for the first time. But don't be afraid, it's not that hard. The following segment is going to be kinda hard to explain, mostly due to the fact that I go through a lot of unnecessary steps, because I'm crippled with OCDs. But the execution in itself is very easy, I promise. The way we're gonna go about it is that we're only gonna carve two portions of the neck first, and then we're gonna blend those two segments together. I begin by marking the position of the 1st and the 12th fret, on the sides and on the back of the neck blank. Here you can see that I also drew a box that is centered on those two positions. The box is 30 mm wide and that's the width of my Shinto rasp. You'll get why in a minute. Now a bit of theory. For this tele, the neck profile I went for is called the Modern C, but I'll leave a link in the description to the other neck profiles that exist. First thing we're gonna do is take the two sections down to their final thickness, because our neck blank is still 19 mm for the moment, and the thickness varies across the whole neck. It's thinner at the nut and thicker at the heel. It is common practice to describe neck profiles by their thickness at the 1st and 12th fret. In my case, I went for 21 and 23. The rectangle here is our neck blank, and we're gonna start by removing some wood to get to the final thickness. I'll spare you the details, but in my case that would be 15 and 17 mm. Now let's go back to the actual neck. You can see that I scribed the line at 15 mm from where the neck meets the fretboard. And then I used my saw and chisel to do the same thing we did with the headstock. I did the same thing at the 12th fret, but with a final thickness of 17 mm instead of 15. Now your neck should look something like this. Okay, this step is completely useless, but I had to show it so you wouldn't wonder why there's some wood missing in the following shots. As you can see, I'm simply planing away the wood between the two sections because that's what I do when I can have a bandsaw. But it ended up being a complete waste of my time. That's one of the perks of figuring things out as you go. You can simply do this later when carving out the rest of the neck. So we're back to the cross section and now the neck is at the right thickness. That means that all we need to do now is to get rid of this excess wood here shown in green. I hope that this won't be too confusing for you, because the concept is very easy, and it allows you to replicate any neck profile you want, not just the Modern C, with a minimal amount of guesswork. I usually do this in Adobe Illustrator. All I'm trying to do here is find two lines that leave me with the least amount of wood to deal with when I'm done rasping. I'm just eyeballing it and there's no right or wrong method. Just make sure that the lines don't go past the profile line. Since I'm doing this in Illustrator, it's very easy for me to get the exact measurements. Let's call them A, B, C, and D for the sake of this tutorial. I will put a file in the description with some measurements that could work, but I really encourage you to do it on your own with your custom numbers. Also, I should point out that most people would do this with just one line, instead of two, but my mom said I was special. That was all theory, but now we can put it into practice. You can of course draw your lines directly onto the wood, but I prefer using painter's tape. To precisely cut those little strips of tape, I used a marking gauge. I'm using the Shinto rasp to do the first cut between the line A and B. And then I place my C and D lines for the second cut. And I just do the exact same thing. To round the three remaining hard edges, I just use sandpaper. Now all we need to do is join the two finished sections. A spoke shave would be ideal for the job, because it will remove wood following nice straight lines, but you can also do it with a rasp. I usually leave my neck very rough at this stage, because I'm gonna go back to it when the transitions are done and the fretboard is glued on. I'll explain later. Talking about transitions. For the headstock transition, just print out this part of the template and transfer this shape onto the wood. The principle is very easy, but the execution can be intimidating. Basically, all you need to do is remove wood so that the neck radius extends as far as it can, without ever reaching the back of the headstock. It's very hard to explain exactly how to do it, and it takes a bit of practice to slowly build up your confidence. But here's a few general tips. This part here is a sanctuary, and it should never be touched. Start away from it and then get closer and closer as you progress. You can and should use a variety of tools to get this job done. You can use a chisel, a carving gouge, a knife, a rasp, a file, sandpaper wrapped around a dowel, anything that can remove tiny amounts of wood. Be patient and mindful of what you're doing. Being able to see things in 3D takes a bit of practice, but you'll get there. Run your fingers on the transition and look for high spots, and mark them with the pencil. Grab the neck in your hand and pretend you're playing open chords. Notice if something feels off, then try to fix it. Also, if you have an actual telly at home, try to have it near you, so you can go back and forth between the factory transition and your own. Use those same tips to do the transition at the heel. There's nothing much to say about it, it's just the exact same thing, only blending different shapes together. Again, you want the radius of the neck to extend as far as you can, without altering the integrity of the heel. Now, if you're afraid you won't be able to make the transition, here's a bonus confidence boost. I don't know how to peel an apple with a knife, and I wouldn't be able to do it even if my life depended on it. We're gonna conclude this part by gluing the fretboard to the neck. Put your truss rod in the channel and make sure it doesn't stick out when it's set to the neutral position. Cut a piece of painter's tape that's a little wider than the truss rod channel. It's gonna prevent the glue squeeze out from reaching the truss rod. There's an amusing debate about whether you should remove the tape or leave it in place. On one side you have people going like, I don't really care, the tape is so thin, why would I even bother? And on the other side you have people losing their minds, because some people choose to leave the tape in place. Up until now I've done both, but from now on I will leave all my future tapes in place. For trolling reasons, but also because I like my masking tape tone. You know, that little scoop in the high mids. If you're a reasonable person, you should probably remove the tape. It's worth mentioning that I'm only gluing the fretboard now, but you can really glue it on at any stage of the build. If you do it earlier, say before the neck carving, then you have the benefit of having an additional flat surface, which makes clamping a lot easier. But it has a downside too. If you screw up your neck carving for whatever reason, then you have to make a new fretboard. That's why I glue things at the very last moment. As always, spread the glue evenly, and make sure that the fretboard and neck center lines are perfectly aligned. To avoid slipping and depending on the type of glue you use, you should consider using locating pins, or sprinkle a tiny bit of salt. I never had to do that. Instead, I just used 2 regular clamps. When everything is in place, I use a therapeutic band to press the fretboard against the neck. For my first build, I used 100 regular rubber bands, and that worked perfectly. Alternatively, you can use some sort of neck rest and or a radius clamping caul, but I'm fine with my trusty therapeutic band. The red clamps you see in this clip are perfectly useless, don't pay attention to them. That's just because I have that irrational fear of tripping on something and letting go of the rubber band. And then, in that very unlikely scenario, the red clamps would keep the tension on the rubber band, as I'm agonizing alone on my workshop's floor. But again, don't pay attention to the red clamps. In the next video, we'll align the neck and the body, and then create the neck pocket as well as all the cavities. We'll work on the frets and install the hardware and the electronics. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about wood finishing, even though I don't know much about it. Okay, now while you process all of that, I'll get back to editing part 3.